Hi everybody, so in the second video, the use case 2, we are going to execute multi-file Python code, and it's all going to be driven by a HTTP or HTTPS request. So if we look at what we're actually going to be doing is the Direktiv API gateway is going to intercept the HTTPS request. As previously, we're going to bypass the authentication plugin just because we don't want to use it for now. Then we're going to copy the body of, the headers of the request into the payload that we're going to send on to the workflow. And as we go through the workflow, it'll become important why this is necessary, because the content type exposes, the content type header exposes a delimiter for the form data. We're going to take that modified payload, we're going to send it off to the target workflow. The target workflow is actually going to extract the multi-part document. So in this case, it'll be two files. It'll be requirements.txt and the actual python.py code that we're going to run. And it's going to extract that using a Python script. We're going to take those two files we've extracted, store it inside Direktiv as two variables. And then we're going to fire up a Python container. We're going to pip install the requirements. We're going to then run the Python code using Python 3. And this is all using a standard default Python container from hub.docker.com. And then we're going to take the output of that, which is a CSV file. The Python script actually calls a HTTPS endpoint, gets some JSON. We convert the JSON into a CSV file. We store the CSV file in Direktiv as a variable. And when we send that out.csv file or output.csv file back to the API gateway, and the API gateway is going to take that, put it in the body as the response and send it back. And just to test it, we're going to use a curl command instead of postman this time and decode the base 64 as we get it and show you the contents of the CSV file. Okay, let's look at the GitHub repo firstly. You can see that we have a couple of files here that we're going to be looking at. Firstly is the requirements.txt file. We're going to install, well, you're going to need the pandas module for the Python. So requirements.txt basically just contains panda. The actual Python code just makes a request to an endpoint that responds with some JSON. I take that JSON and we read it into a panda. Well, we use panda to read it as a CSV, and then we write the output.csv file with that JSON data in it, obviously converted to CSV. So a very, very simple Python script. But obviously important is this import pandas. We want to show how we run multiple files as part of the gateway and workflow execution. So, requirements.txt to install and pandas to execute. Right, so from here on, and I'm going to switch over to my VS Code environment, because this just is a mirror of my VS Code environment. And again, Direktiv obviously synchronizes the gateway, the Git repo using the mirror function. So whenever I make an update into the GitHub repo, it gets automatically synced here. So let's look at our VS Code environment. Like I said, there's the Python file, requirements.txt file, and then let's look at the gateway configuration first. So again, this time I've created an endpoint called v1/run Python code multi-file. If we look at the gateway configuration in Direktiv, again, just want to point out that this is the gateway config, run multi-file. So it is an endpoint that gets created, so that's the full endpoint call. In this case, we're supporting both get and post, so very simple get and post. And then the target plugin is going to be a workflow. So in this case, the previous one we were using just a single file. In this case, we're going to pass it off to a workflow called run docker Python code service gateway multi-file. Yeah, crazy long name, I know, but it explains what we're going to do. One of the first inbound plugins we're going to do is we're going to do request convert. This inbound plugin copies, again, all the headers coming in from the request into the payload that gets sent to this workflow. And the reason this is important will become clear later. I'm going to show you in the comment section of the VS Code part. But we copy all the headers, and you can add headers, queries, body, everything. I don't want to omit anything. I want everything to go. And then when we're done, when the workflow is executed, we have our response that we need to send back to the end user. The gateway is going to apply this JavaScript. So let's go and have a look at the configs in the Visual Studio Code. So very simply, that's the request convert. So copy all my headers, body, everything into the payload, send it off to this workflow in this namespace, and then when I respond back, I want to do a couple of things. I want to set a content type header. I want to send the content type disposition to the file name I'm sending back. And I want to do content transfer encoding base64. I want to tell the endpoint that I'm sending back base64. Right. So this is my API gateway configuration. Now let's look at the actual workflow. Right. By the way, what's happening is to send this multi-file, I'm going to show you the Python configuration because it's easier to understand. We're basically sending form data, and the form data we're sending an array called Python files of requirements.txt and pythonMultifileExample.py. So those are the two files we have in here, requirements.txt and pythonMultifileExample.py. Right. And when we send this into Direktiv, I'll show you what the input looks like when we execute this. I'm not going to use Python. When we execute this, I'm going to use this curl command. So curl HTTPS, that endpoint, -f, and then we add those two files, which is in this code directory. And then we're going to take that output and base64 decode it when we get it. All right, so let's look at the workflow. Firstly, what you'll notice is this workflow has a non-stateful container. So it means when this workflow starts up, we're going to spin up a Python container. This is just hub.docker.com Python container. It's nothing strange or weird about it. But what we're doing is we're injecting this sidecar, this init container for us, and that translates the commands that we're sending from the workflow into commands that the container can understand. It also allows us to run any container now. Right, so what does the input look like from the gateway? So remember I said that one of the things that we're doing in the gateway is we're running this request convert where we copy everything from the headers, body, everything into the payload of the workflow. So the payload of the workflow looks like this, and this is obviously, a lot of it's been taken out, but URL parameters matches the URL parameters, the queries, headers matches the headers, body matches body, and I think query parameters. So one of the important headers that we need to look at is this content type. In the multi-part form data, this content type defines the, let's call it the separator of the body, of the contents of the body. So we use that. If we look at, let's look at what a decode looks like. So this is the form data we receive, and let's decode base64. If we paste this in here, this is what it looks like. So it's got a separator and the data of the file, well, the contents and data sections of the file, and then the separator and contents data of the file. And if you compare it to this, this will be the separator. So the important part here is we need this content type, which is obviously in the headers, and the body combined in our workflow. And what the workflow will do is it's going to run extract files.py, the Python extract script. This extract script is actually, it uses the content and the body to split these two things, and it creates a JSON object that is sent back. And that JSON object looks like this. It is file name, requirements, content, the content, file name, Python, and content, the content of that Python script. So we use the body combined with the contents. We send it into this Python code. And the way we run this is the Python extract files.python is on the GitHub repo. I'm telling Direktiv, take that Python file and copy it as a file into my container, my Python container, and then pip install request toolbelts, because that's what this needs, and then Python 3 extract files, and as input to this this Python script, send it the body and send it that delimiter, which we receive, which is in the payload, which we receive from the API gateway. And like I said, the only thing it produces is output that looks like this: file name requirements, content pandas, file name Python, whatever the file name was, and the content. So, and these are obviously set based on the request that we send from Postman or Curl or whatever. So this could be any file. Right, so now we have these files extracted from our initial request. What do we do next? And they are now, JSON objects that we pass from this point to the next. I take those files and then I create two internal Direktiv variables. I store requirements.txt and the contents of that, and I create a variable called requirements.txt, and I store the contents, which is just text. And then I create another variable called MultifileExample, and I store the contents of this Python script. So that gives us two variables that we can use now in the next section. And the next section is actually going to execute that requirements, execute firstly a pip install of the requirements, and then running the Python file. Right, so on to the next one. What do I do next? Well, in this case, the next state is I'm telling Direktiv, fetch me the two variables that I just stored and create them as files in my container. Right, so when Direktiv starts up the Python container, or when we have this active Python container now, Direktiv will copy the two variables as files onto the working directory. And from that point forward, it is just running Python stuff. So pip install that requirements.txt, and then Python 3 run. And then, as I said, this produces a file called output.csv on the working directory. This statement instructs, well, we're copying that output.csv into a special directory that's created by this sidecar, or this init container. Copy the output.csv file into out instance output.csv. And what this will do is, this out directory redirects this file as an instance variable in Direktiv with this name, which now means that we're taking the output.csv file from the container and we're shipping it into Direktiv as a variable called output.csv with the contents in it. And then I can send that back into the API gateway just by ending the state of the workflow with that contents. So I'm basically creating a JSON object called output, and I'm taking the contents of the output.csv file. Now remember, at this point it is still all base64 encoded, because when we pull this content, we didn't set it as text plain. It's just a binary file we're pulling, so we're storing that as base64 encoded. So the API gateway will receive base64. Now you can go and modify this in the API gateway later on. I'm not going to do that because I'm going to show you first how all this fits together. Right, so if I run this curl command, what's going to happen in Direktiv? First thing is, we have it's triggered by the API gateway. Obviously, we're extracting the multi-part, so this is what it looks like. This is the original one. And we're installing the request.toolbelt, which was still part of the first state. You can see it, and then it runs there's the pip install, then it runs the command. It extracts these two files from it. We store those two files, and then we transition into the next one where we're going to actually run the code. So running the code means installing the requirements.txt, pip install -i requirements.txt. It installs the panda requirements and its dependencies. Then we're going to run the MultifileExample.py. Now, just to show everybody what it looks like, I have ls-lr at lar, so recursive list at the end, and you can see what happens is, so Direktiv copied these two files, the script created output.csv file, and then we copied to out instance. So if you copy to instance namespace or workflow, I should have copied it to file, but why not? If we copy it to output.csv instance, it creates a variable, and now what I've done is I've read that variable in the final state, read the variable and send it as output, and the output looks like this: output, which you can see from this JSON object, and var.output.csv, which is the contents. Right, what happens in the curl command is we receive the CSV, and we received the base64 encoded, and then we just decoded with CSV, and there you go. That's it. Multi-file Python execution on demand. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us or contact me directly. Like I said, all these examples are available in the demo workflows. It's private at the moment. Once we make the videos live, we'll make this public.